edition of Shaka Extra Time.
It's a pleasure to be with you one more time.
Yeah, thank you so much. So last week you're talking about Darfur region in South Sudan. You had this remarkable lady who has been championing, leading some demonstrations on Darfur, championing the cause, wanting Darfur to stay in the news. What was your impression?
I think Nima is remarkably articulate. She obviously not only does she know what is happening there in Darfur, which of course is located in western Sudan, an area, by the way, that is larger than France. But she also lived there, and she's in constant contact with people who are living there, especially those who are living in displaced camps. You can imagine people living in their own country, and yet, frankly, you're talking about people living like refugees in their own country.
Until recently, Darfur was not in the news. What could have happened?
Darfur has been in the news, I mean, since late 2000, around 2007. You have had the United Nations peacekeeping force there for very many years now. And there are probably about 1 million to probably 1 million people who are in refugee camps, so internally displaced camps. And you have had, of course, the Janjaweed causing havoc here and there, and of course they are supposed to be government-backed militia. You've also had reportedly government forces sometimes, in fact, also doing more of the same. Nothing seems to have changed for a very long time.
So what keeps the Darfurians going? Because they have had to deal with a lot, especially you have the Janjaweed there, you have Sudanese armed groups, Sudanese groups sponsored by the government in Khartoum, and you also have these other rebel groups that have been going on in Darfur.
Yeah, you do have, of course, the conflict, and the conflict takes two parties, as you say. You do have, of course, the rebel groups who obviously are in conflict with government and government militias. But you also have certain things going on in the sense that, let's face it, you have a UN peacekeeping force. It can't be there doing absolutely nothing. I think it has helped to bring at least a semblance of normalcy to a certain degree, even though people think that it could do much more than it is able to accomplish so far.
How about people who say that maybe the UN peacekeeping force on the ground hasn't done much? When you talk about UN, I mean that they're just basically there observing peace, not keeping peace. You have situations whereby the Khartoum government continues to use bombs, chemical weapons on ordinary citizens. So what's the role of the UN in that particular case?
I have seen, of course, reports by Amnesty International, although I have not been able to verify them. Yes, there are people who, in fact, think that the UN peacekeeping force is pretty much, what in their words, is pretty much a sort of a cash cow. That these people are earning a lot of money and what have you, and frankly, they are not fulfilling the mandate as it were. But there are also others who say, yes, the problems, frankly, are enormous, because you're talking about a force probably around 20,000 people. And as I told you, Darfur is a large area, very huge, to the extent that it is greater. It is much larger than the Republic of France. And so, frankly, it's not just about having a peacekeeping force there. What is fundamentally needed here, frankly, is the almighty political will from Khartoum to cut a deal and follow through with what they agree, so that people can begin to live their normal lives.
What seems to be the problem in Darfur? Because when you talk to ordinary people, they really don't understand the conflict in Darfur. Could you maybe share with us the genesis or what started this conflict?
The fundamental root causes, when you talk about Darfur in the context of the Sudan conflict, especially when you look at it through the lens of northern Sudan, where you're talking about Khartoum, where they are largely Arabs, and in terms of religion, they are Muslim. And then you go to the south, you're talking about Christianity, you're talking about animists, if you will. But when you go to western Sudan, the irony is that you are talking about people who are Sudanese, relatively black, not so much as the black people of South Sudan, but they are also Muslim, which in a sense puts them on the same page with Arab North. The problem is that the area of Darfur is very fertile. It also has a lot of wealth in terms of minerals, actually. We're talking about gold, they say. You probably have platinum there. There are others who have suggested that, in fact, research suggests there is even oil, you know, that kind of wealth. So I think the conflict here, frankly, is about resources, control of the resources, and of course, who benefits from it, because politics, simply put, is about Paul, who gets what, when, where, and how.
Interesting. In fact, let me maybe go back to that that you just brought up. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has been indicted, of course, for war crimes committed in Darfur. But the guy continues to enjoy his life, and he's not bothered by the indictment or the warrants against him. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, he's very lucky that he has what you would call African solidarity. As we talk, you know that there are 2 African countries so far which were members of the International Criminal Court and who have basically signaled that they are withdrawing from the Rome Statute. We're talking about the Republic of Burundi. We're also talking about the government of South Africa. Kenya is also in the process, and a lot of other countries. What is interesting here is that despite, in fact, the charges by the ICC, Sudan is not a member of the Rome Statute. They never signed the Rome Statute, and so they are not a member. The problem is, of course, that the UN Security Council has the powers, in a sense, to refer a case to The Hague. And in this particular case, it is the United Nations Security Council which did that. But so far, so long as it does not have cooperation from member countries on the African continent, I don't see how it can deliver, you know, the Sudanese president. And right now, there is in fact a campaign at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, calling on all the African countries, in fact, who are members of the ICC, and they happen to be a third, in fact, of what makes the ICC. They're calling on them to withdraw. And if they withdraw, can you then have, in fact, an ICC?
I mean, that's a very interesting point. In fact, recently, Burundi and South Africa, and obviously, I can see other countries following suit. But what are the fundamental problems here? When you talk about war crimes, Sudan government has come out and said, no, we didn't commit any crimes. Maybe the crimes that are being committed in Darfur are actually being committed by the different rebel groups. And therefore, the Sudanese government has absolutely nothing to do with what's happening in Darfur. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, there's no question, Paul, that the Sudanese government, just like any other government or any other individual or group for that matter, is entitled to its own opinion. What it is not entitled to is its different sets of facts. Because the ICC at least tells us it has done investigations to such an extent that it came up with evidence, in their view, the type of evidence that is incontrovertible, not liable to falter. That is the basis upon which they decided to issue an arrest warrant of a sitting president. It's not a very simple thing to issue an arrest warrant to an incumbent president, mind you, because guess what? These people are supposed to have immunity, but the ICC has no respect for immunity.
Our hard-working intern, Emma, has just handed me a couple of questions. Actually, comments from some of the people viewing this. Let's maybe get to Patricia Nambi from Uganda. She says, behind every successful man, there is a strong woman. Thus, behind every strong nation, there are strong women. Let Darfur Women Action Group encourage Sudanese women to join the forces and provide security to the nation, especially women and children. Wars affect mainly women and children. It's for those reasons that politics in the country should be dominated by women. Your take?
Well, I think that, I think at least based on, last week's edition of Straight Talk Africa, it's very clear that the Darfur Women Network Group is doing a little bit of that. But it can only do so much, really, because at the end of the day, it needs support, especially from the international community. It is the international community, according at least to NEMA, which is supposed to be really doing its part. And so far as she's concerned, it really hasn't delivered. She also criticized, for example, the United States. The United States has a special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, that is Ambassador Donald Booth. As far as she's concerned, this man has only been to Sudan only once in the last so many years. I don't know, I have not been able to verify that. But based on what has been going on, obviously, in South Sudan, I wouldn't blame him because the focus seems to be largely on Juba, really, lately, rather than anywhere else.
Let's go to another comment from William Kululo from Liberia. He says, I think women should follow the example of Liberian women and travel to peace conferences and demand warlords to sign a peace agreement that will bring a total end to the conflict. The women, including the wives of those Sudanese warlords, should stand up as mothers to bring peace to Darfur. Your take?
I think some of those things really have been done, but when you talk about peace, you're talking about a process. It is very easy, for example, for parties to cut a deal and sign the piece of paper. The problem, of course, as they say, is left in, or as they say, the devil is in the details. Now, these details, which someone referred to as a devil, have to be implemented. And the issue is, can a deal, in fact, at the end of the day, be implemented? A lot of things have really been done. There have been deals that have been cut, but they have not been implemented fully the way they are supposed to be implemented. So I think what is needed again here is really the political will. There seems to be a deficit of the political will. And if it is not there, I think the international community can probably take it to another level. It can come up with some mechanism that will make it impossible, for example, for the government of Khartoum to continue doing business as usual, and also for the rebels to continue doing things differently. Because at the end of the day, you need to bring these two parties to agree that it is in their best interest for life, or at least for a semblance of peace and stability, to be restored. You can even talk about going beyond that, because peace, frankly, is not necessarily the absence of war. Peace has to be a reflection, for example, of the presence of socio-economic justice for all people. You have to talk about reconciliation. You have to talk about accountability. Short of that, you continue with impunity, my brother.
But in fairness to what you just said, recently, as of 2 weeks ago, the Sudanese government held an inter-party dialogue where they brought all these different parties to the table. They also engaged the international community. The UN, the outgoing UN Secretary General, said they've worked very, very hard to bring parties together. And there have been peace talks as we speak to try to bring these people together. What seems to be the problem?
You're right in saying that there has been an effort, of course, on both sides, meeting in Addis Ababa, for example, and the former South African President Thabo Mbeki. And yes, a deal was cut, papers were signed, signatures were appended, and what have you. But frankly, there are some voices, frankly, that continue to say that they don't think that is the best way to go about things. So unless and until and unless you reach a point where people feel that there is something good or positive for them in that deal that was signed, I don't think it's going to make any difference. Let's wait and see. You had, for example, earlier this year, you did have a referendum, in fact, in Darfur. I think it was about Apple and what have you. Darfur, as you know, is a region. But because the government wanted to divide the area so that you can divide it in 5 different regions and what have you, that is what they say the results of the referendum actually suggested. And this is what they are going to do. The question is, Are the people of Darfur on the ground, are they sincerely on the same page? Talking to the lady that was on Straight Talk Africa last week, it doesn't look like they're on the same page.
Let's go to another comment from Zakaria Mwaifuani from Tanzania. He says the role of women in Darfur is to enhance schools to promote education on universal suffrage. Once a universal suffrage is achieved, women will have an opportunity to elect a president who will enhance growth, democracy, as well as human freedom. This person sort of echoes the same sentiments the other people have raised before. Do you share that kind of maybe take on his part?
You can talk about all those things. Of course, they are very, very important. There's no question about it. But before you do that, my brother, you need a foundation. You need an architecture of a foundation. And the foundation in this particular case, sincerely, I would have to say is the restoration of peace and confidence among the people of Darfur. Until and unless you do that, everything else you are talking about is just like romance.
Another interesting, speaking about romance, now this person, Emmanuel Kachel Martin Wagal from South Sudan says Darfur women's immediate role should be trying to convince their husbands to accept peace. And that's in line, of course, with the romance that you just talked about.
That is almost thinking that perhaps the men actually don't think for themselves, or even the women do not think, because in fact, if they were not thinking, then you wouldn't probably have this group called Darfur Women Network Group.
Okay, let's go to a tweet from Emmanuel from Tanzania. He says, Darfur Women Action Group, political establishments, politicians' priorities. But these women are wonderful and are agents of future change. Do you get why? Okay.
No, I don't really understand the point.
Okay, he says that the role of politicians is to create the political establishment to create priorities, and those priorities don't involve working with maybe ordinary folks and doing things that are supposed to support the ordinary people. But for them, their goal is really to set in place things that work in their favor as politicians, but not to help out ordinary people.
The role, of course, of any government or any politician for that matter, first and foremost, again, is to provide security. You have to provide security so that people can have confidence in themselves, in their abilities to go on doing a lot of other things that are very necessary to sustain life. I think that, again, here, what you do have, you have to create an environment that not only empowers, but makes people feel comfortable, feel confident enough that they have the power, they have the opportunity to make a difference, to make sure that, for example, their children can go to school. There has to be some kind of service delivery so that when somebody gets sick, at least they can go to a dispensary or a hospital or a health facility and they can be taken care of. They have to make sure that families have something to eat so that life is normal, really. So until and unless you have that situation, I don't think we can start talking about some of those things, really.
Okay, you seem to be having a lot of people asking, wanting to ask you about South Sudan, and I think since we are talking about Darfur, Sudan, maybe it's perfectly fine us to talk about South Sudan. Let's go to a comment from Yona Nyerinda from Zambia. The issue here is natural resources, oil for that matter. Let the government help to protect these resources from plunders. Let the integrity of Sudan be protected by the UN and all will be well. Your take?
Of course, the President of the Republic of Sudan will tell you that Sudan does have sovereignty. It has sovereignty just like any other country on this planet Earth. I don't see why, in fact, the resources of the country under normal circumstances should not be protected by the indigenous people of the sovereignty of the Republic of Sudan. In fact, to be honest with you, I have often wondered why the people in South Sudan are fighting. We've talked about that many, many times. You have a country that is incredibly huge, much larger than the current East African Community member countries.
Correct.
You have, to even make it interesting, you have very, very few people. You have a population of between 10 and probably 11 million people, in which case, really, you shouldn't be killing each other. You should, in fact, create opportunities for producing more children. You need more people in order to be able to work that land to the benefit of the people of that God-given country. You have incredible resources in terms of oil, in terms of gold, in terms of almost any other important mineral that you can talk about. And to even make it better, my friend, you have a land that is incredibly fertile to such a degree that you could in fact turn that country into the bread basket, not only of the region there, but probably to the Middle East and what have you. And every individual in that country, frankly, would be well off. I mean, if there was a government, sincerely, that was socially, economically, and politically sensitive to the needs of its people, everybody would be well off.
Shaka, are you suggesting that the government, the current government in South Sudan, or the politicians in South Sudan really don't care about the ordinary people? They're just doing this for their own, maybe, egos?
You know, it's not simply a question even of suggesting. You have to look at the evidence. There was the recent Central Report, for example, where the president and his family seems to have fingers everywhere. You are even talking in this particular case, a child of President Salva Kiir Mayardit, who is aged 12 years, Paul. 12 years. This president, according to that report, this son of the president, his occupation in his passport is son of president. Son of the president is his occupation. And the other thing that is interesting about that is that he was found, a 12-year kid, to have shares in a very important petroleum company, having about 20 to 25 shares in that company, 12 years old. And then you have a lot of these properties in neighboring Kenya, owned by the president. There are also some properties allegedly owned by the major opposition leader, Dr. Riek Machar. And then you have, of course, properties owned by the chief of the general staff. In other words, the commander, in fact, of the army, a General Paul Malong. This is a man who has multi-million-dollar property in Kenya, in Uganda. He has a son who is doing incredibly well in Cape Town, South Africa, a man who flies first class. He's 28 years old. He flies first class wherever he goes. He actually lives in presidential suites wherever he goes, whether it is in Monte Carlo, whether it is in Nevada, Las Vegas. You know why he is able to do that? Because he can help some companies, some individuals get contracts from Sudan, because he says, from what he has posted, in fact, on Facebook, Twitter, and what have you, he has unfettered access to the president, unfettered access to any minister in Juba.
Would you, Shaka, let's go to another comment from Muzahura Ambrose Bohinja from Rwanda. He says, South Sudan should be considered a failed state, so another peacekeeping organization like the UN should take over the country until it's ready to govern its own affairs. Do you agree?
I don't know. I've heard some people also share the same view with that gentleman from Rwanda. Because frankly, if you look at the situation as we talk, you have hundreds of thousands of people who are internally displaced, who are in effect refugees in their own country. They do not have access to food, they do not have access to water, they do not have access to some decent places where to sleep and what have you. In other words, really, when you talk about life, they are not in play. You also have a lot of people who are, in fact, being looked after by the UN peacekeeping mission in Juba. They are living in UN, supervised camps. You're talking about 12,000 here, 12,000, a force of 12,000 people. And recently, the UN Security Council also, passed a resolution allowing another 4,000 UN peacekeeping, force to be deployed. So you're talking about in the next couple of months or so, we are going to be looking at a force of about 16,000 UN force. That's big. That's big. The question is, can it in fact deliver? If the government of Juba can agree, then of course it should be able to secure some very strategic positions in the capital, including the international airport. It should be able to occupy a position that provides the opportunity for the government and the opposition forces to be separated, so that then maybe they can figure out a way of again working together. It's not the absence of deals that have been cut. It's not the absence of signing agreements and what have you. There have been so many agreements that have been signed, Paul, and you know that. The devil is, as they say, is not only in the details, but in this particular case, implementation. But you cannot implement anything unless somebody really has the political will. The question is, how do you, in fact, bring about this?
On that note, Shaka, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you again next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Thank you so much.
So you're most welcome.
Yep. Tune in next week again for another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Bye for now.